Thanks again for having me. I'm delighted to join you today. I'm so sorry that I haven't been able to join the other meetings, but I do have a good excuse. My daughter was born at the beginning of May, and she's made it rather difficult to get up early enough in the eastern US to join you. So I suppose I'm going to come in at the very end and sort of proselytize and run without any context regarding what you've been discussing, but I have been keeping track of the titles, and I see that you've had some real luminaries from the field. So I'm delighted to be amongst that group. The work I'm going to show you today was really driven by two people from my lab, Erin Reed and Praveen Suhatharan. Erin was a grad student with me and has now gone back to medical school. And Praveen is currently an RA, and I'm hoping to transition him into being a grad student. He's been a fabulous colleague throughout the pandemic. And he and I have worked really, really closely together on what I'm going to show you today, which in a nutshell is tracking the impact of the evolving pandemic on people's beliefs that they self-report, and also their task behavior on a belief updating task. And what I'm going to show you is that policies and responses to the pandemic have really impacted people's paranoia and changed how they respond to sort of standard reinforcement learning games that track how you change your mind in light of evolving evidence. These aren't within subject studies, they're not perfect, but we think there's a really nice signal there that backs up some things that people have sort of speculated about historically regarding volatility in the real world and how that leads people to reach out and sort of blame other people for their misfortunes, which in a sense is how we might think about conspiracy theorizing. This is an ancient Chinese curse. It's actually not really. It's an apocryphal story. But the idea is that you might be cursed to live in interesting times where lots and lots of things are happening and things are changing very rapidly. And we can sort of relate that to historical events from the Great Fire of Rome, the Reichstag fire, the Black Plague, to more contemporary events like Sandy Hook and September 11th, 9/11. All of which were sort of extremely notable, almost black swan events that had huge implications economically, socially, and politically, and led to sort of changes, or at least reconsiderations of how people live their lives and what sort of things they find to be important. And all of these events bred huge amounts of conspiracy theorizing. We know that at least 60% of Americans believe at least one conspiracy theory regarding aliens or Pizzagate. And more recently, this has sort of culminated in what I consider to be the sort of master conspiracy theory, which is QAnon. And the data I'm going to show you today, really summarized by this icon, reflect what we've been working on with regards to people's beliefs about the QAnon conspiracy theory, their beliefs about the pandemic and pandemic procedures and efforts to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. I don't actually have any brain data to show you, but I think what I'll show you with regards to behavior ought to be convincing that our brains and our minds have been changed by this collective experience. And I'm going to think about it in the context of a biopsychosocial model, which is the sort of popular model in the context of psychiatry, right? That there are sort of intersecting factors that contribute to our mental health, our mental well-being, and our beliefs that sort of lean on one another to the point that when one of them is changed, our responses and sort of the processes that attract in the other two are also updated and altered. So, for example, if you were to have a stroke that damaged your brain, that would change your psychological function and likely change your social function and how you interact with the environment. And on the flip side, as we've all experienced over the last 18 months, when social and environmental events conspire, that can change our psychology and ultimately our biology too. So I've used the word paranoia quite a few times. Chris mentioned I've written quite a few papers about paranoia recently. Just a quick definition. It's the belief that other people intend to harm you. And it often occurs in the context of serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, where it might even reach to the level of persecutory delusion. But it also occurs in the context of neurological illnesses like dementia, traumatic brain injury, and stroke. It's induced by psychostimulant use, so people who use lots of cocaine or methamphetamine, which will be relevant later on, actually become more paranoid. And it's extremely common in the general non-clinical population. I'm sure many of you are academics, and that can lead us often to have concerns about the intentions of our department chairs or colleagues that might not necessarily align with our own aims and desires. It's characterized by sort of three different things: a degree of suspicion and hypervigilance. So you're sort of on the lookout for things to happen in the world. Those things, as a sort of corollary, that things in the world seem extremely relevant for you personally, that there might be messages for you specifically in events or in people's behavior, often rising to the level of sort of thinking that things on TV or in the newspaper are written specifically for you or about you. And behaviorally, it manifests in sort of hostility towards other people and hypersensitivity. So, this is sort of clinical paranoia or paranoia along the continuum. One, I think, could make a similar case for people who adopt conspiracy beliefs too. And that's the argument I'm going to make today. And critically, as we saw on with the insurrection in September, in January, these beliefs can come together and really garner violent acts, aggression, and sort of societal unrest more broadly. So I think there's a real impetus to try and understand this better. I don't have any prescriptions for how to combat it. We're working on some ideas now. I might speculate at the end in the discussion, but my plan is to sort of try and understand the basic mechanisms better with a view to turning that understanding into mitigation strategies potentially. So these sorts of beliefs are fairly prevalent. About, as I mentioned, 60% of Americans endorse at least one conspiracy theory. About 5% of the population might have conspiratorial ideas that rise to the sort of severity of delusions of persecution in terms of sort of engendering distress, a great degree of preoccupation and conviction as well. But then, they sort of fall down the hierarchy to more normative ideas that I think we've all experienced from time to time in our daily lives and in our careers. There are a number of theories, a sort of social threat theory that we have a system in our brain that's engaged in order to detect threats to us socially, and that threat system is sort of overactive or overengaged in people who become paranoid and entertain conspiratorial ideas. And that leads us to sort of avoid catastrophic errors by detecting them early, and allows us to sort of flexibly recategorize our social relationships. This is work sort of pioneered by Nicola Rehani and Vaughan Bell, some colleagues in London, with whom I sort of kind of disagree fairly heartily. I don't think we have this sort of, I do think we have a module in our brains that's dedicated to managing these sorts of representations and relationships. I'm going to show you, I think, today that process is not necessarily the purview of paranoia, and it's actually a much more simple and basic mechanism that's awry in people who form paranoid ideas and persecutory delusions. So our hypothesis is that individuals with paranoia exhibit deficits in basic belief updating. There's a long history of this sort of work with tasks like the beads task, where people are drawing beads or being shown beads drawn from a jar and making up their minds really rapidly, but also switching very promiscuously between their conclusions. These are some data from my colleague Jim Waltz from a reversal learning task, showing that the extent to which people switch between options during a reversal learning task correlates very strongly with their delusion-like beliefs and hallucinatory experiences. These are clinical data from patients with schizophrenia. What we're going to do is take a similar sort of task and track it in the general population and see if we can see the same sorts of relationships. The first part of my talk has been published in eLife last year. This is one of the papers that Chris mentioned, spearheaded by Erin as part of her graduate school work. So broadly, we're interested in tracking people's behavior and applying computational models to try and understand where those choices might be coming from and infer the sorts of beliefs and belief updating processes that are in play to explain the kinds of choices that they make. So the behavioral task that we present to people is just a really simple card game where they're picking between 3 decks of cards. One of the decks is richer with rewards than the others. That deck changes every 10 trials or so that their task is to always pick the best deck, but they know that the best deck might change. And by changing the underlying probabilities too, we can inject some further volatility into the task environment, wherein it becomes much more difficult at times in the task to judge whether you've merely made a probabilistic error, right? So most of the time you get reward from the blue deck, some of the time you get a loss. If you experience a loss, is that really a signal that the world has changed, or is it merely just predictable run-of-the-mill noise? So we're going to quantify belief updating under uncertainty, and here we're going to define beliefs as associations between actions and outcomes. So what are the best decks to choose, and how do those decks change over time? And as I mentioned, we're going to inject volatility into those action-outcome associations. Critically, there's no social threat or social context in this first experiment. And as I mentioned numerous times now, we're going to manipulate the uncertainty that they experience in the context of the task. We do this with probabilistic reversal learning, which has a very long history in behavioral neuroscience. So we know quite a bit about how rats respond to similar sorts of contingencies and contingency changes, both in terms of the underlying neurochemistry and the circuit neurobiology. There's pretty good consistency across species. We can show the same sort of patterns of behavioral choices in humans as we see in primates and in rodents. And so one of the sort of attractive features in this initial project was we could leverage data that already existed from some colleagues in the department, Jane Taylor and Steph Groman, who'd given methamphetamine to rodents chronically, methamphetamine being one of those compounds that induces a paranoid state in people who use it chronically. And we could relate what happens to the rodents under methamphetamine to what happens with paranoia in our human participants. So as I mentioned, 3 decks of cards, they lead to rewards with varying different degrees of probability, and those probabilities change over time. So the best deck is 90% rewarded, so 9 out of 10 trials you get the reward, 10% you get the loss. But after a few choices of that deck, the best deck switches, right? And so the red one becomes the best one. And your task is to sort of decide when is it optimal or appropriate to switch from the previous best deck to finding the new best deck. And as I mentioned, a loss could signify that you ought to switch, or that it's merely sort of predictable run-of-the-mill noise. And critically, I mentioned that we're going to amp up unexpected uncertainty. So in the first half of this initial experiment, the underlying probabilities on the decks were 90, 50, and 10% reward. In the second half of the task, we switched those unsignaled and uncued to the participant to 80, 40, and 20% reward. And as you might imagine, it becomes much more difficult in that second half of the task to discern, are you merely experiencing more probabilistic errors than you were before, or is this really a signal that the underlying sort of generative model of the task has changed? And how do you respond? With regards to the computational modeling, we're going to do something called a hierarchical Gaussian filter, which you can really think about as sort of layers of different learners tracking different features of the task. So at the lowest level, the most basic belief is whether or not you received win or loss feedback from the task. Did you get plus 50 or minus 10 on a particular trial? There are deck values that you're tracking to at the intermediate layer of belief. So that's how rich or lean are the rewards on the 3 different decks currently. And then at level 3, that volatility belief kicks in. So that's the extent to which you think that the underlying probabilities and deck values are changing throughout the task. And those layers of belief are sort of weighted relative to one another with some learning rate parameters or coupling parameters that really govern one's sensitivity to volatility in the task. both phasic volatility, so signals that something sort of surprising has happened and changed with regards to the underlying probability, and tonic volatility, right? So how changeable are things in the task usually? I think I just explained all of that in one go, so I'll just skip through this. So here we go. Oh, and I should mention that at the highest level of belief, this will be a really important parameter throughout the talk, there's a sort of prior on how changeable or volatile you think that the task is going to be. So before you even experienced any trials, how much volatility are you expecting? I don't want to give the game away, but this is the parameter that changes as a function of experiencing the pandemic. So people's beliefs about the task change as a result of volatility experiences in the real world. And that relates to their paranoia too. Let's see. Go through this. Right, so tonic volatility, so the impact of state-independent volatility on the deck value. So these reversals that are happening sort of somewhat predictably and something that they expect. And phasic volatility, right? The rules of the game have shifted and the underlying probabilities are now completely different. And the rules are something that you need to relearn anew. So we can compare these parameters estimated from participants' behavior across different subject categories, so people who have more or less paranoia, and across different changes in the contingency context. So when we keep the task 90, 50, 10 throughout versus changing it repeatedly or switching from extremely uncertain to more certain too. So we've run all the possible sort of different versions and permutations of the task as well. We have 3 experiments in this initial paper, an in-lab small pilot where we invited people in who were in our Connecticut mental health center. So these are people who are seeking mental health services. They self-identify as having beliefs that contradict their friends and family members' well-held beliefs and lead to sort of disruptions in their lives. We then replicated those effects online, so making use of that sort of continuum of paranoia that occurs in the general population. And as I mentioned, we borrowed some data from rats on methamphetamine from my colleagues Jane Taylor and Steph Groman to see whether or not the behavior and the model parameters estimated from that behavior in rats matches on to what we see in paranoid humans. So just as I've explained, the original sort of first half of the task, the choosing between decks with 90, 50, and 10% reward probability that are reversing about every 10 trials. And then halfway through, those probabilities switch to 80, 40, and 20. That second half of the task is more volatile. And we also get people to rate their paranoia initially with this SCID, Paranoid Personality Questionnaire, which sort of asks in about 9 or 10 different ways whether or not you're bothered by and worried about the intentions of other people. Do you often detect hidden threats, insults in the things that people say or do? And what we find, just like Jim Waltz found, regardless of people's actual diagnostic status, the extent to which they have lots of paranoid beliefs rated on that scale, they show excessive switching between choices, between the decks, even when they've won, which is a really irrational thing to do when you think about it, right? If your task is to pick the best deck continuously, if you've just won, you really ought to stick with the deck that you just chose. And instead, people who are highly paranoid switch between decks significantly more than those with lower paranoia. And that's cashed out in terms of their model parameters too. So you can see they have stronger prior beliefs about volatility and stronger volatility learning rates than the low paranoia participants. And their coupling parameters are stronger. So the extent to which they're sensitive to phasic volatility, to the extent to which they believe that events in the task signify that the world underlying the task has changed, is much stronger, even from the beginning of training in people with higher paranoia. So like I mentioned, we then did a replication study online where we ran the 4 different versions of the task. So 160 trials of just 90, 50, 10, switching obviously every 10 trials, but no change in the underlying contingencies. We below that had our sort of standard version where things change from rich and sort of predictable to leaner and more unpredictable halfway through. And we had 2 control versions of the task where things remained 80, 40, 20 throughout, So a sort of harder version of the task, if you like, that remained difficult, and then a harder version of the task that became easier halfway through. And we could run these through Amazon Mechanical Turk and identify people with more or less paranoia and see how they behave on these different versions of the task. And what we find, just like in person, online, people with higher paranoia show more of this win switching behavior. So a really nice replication of the behavioral findings. So whenever someone's highly paranoid, they show more of this signature win switching. They also show sort of a change in the lose stay rate. So they're less likely to sort of persevere in light of poor feedback if they're highly paranoid. And when we fit the model, as you can see, exactly the same pattern of model parameters is observed as the best fitting model to their behavior in the online case as we saw in the laboratory. I won't bore you by going through all of these because we've got quite a bit of data to go through. But their prior beliefs about volatility and their learning rates from volatility and unexpected uncertainty are elevated if they're paranoid. Behaviorally, across all versions of the task, we see this nice sort of elevation in win switch rate in highly paranoid people. That's particularly the case if we use a metric from behavioral ecology to look at their choice stochasticity. We see the biggest difference in the versions of the task where there's a transition, right? So when things are sort of stable, even though they're difficult, people don't win switch as much. The key differences between paranoia, high paranoia and low paranoia emerge in those task versions where there's a switch from being easy to hard or hard to easy. And that's reflected in the parameter estimates too. So that easy to difficult transitioning task seems to be the best version for picking out behavioral differences between high and low paranoia and model parameter differences between high and low paranoia. So that's the one we're going to use going forward in our subsequent experiments. We can also covary for various different sort of mitigating factors that might be relevant. So demographics like age, gender, ethnicity, and race, self-reported mental health diagnoses and medication use, as well as other mental health difficulties like depression and anxiety that we can rate with various rating scales. We also asked them how far they got in school, how much their sort of self-reported income was, and we tested their performance on Shane Frederick's cognitive reflection task as well. And what we find is that kappa in this initial study, so the extent to which people are sensitive to and learn from volatility, survives correction for all of those important mitigating factors. We also use the model to simulate data and check that it matches to the things that we observe in our participants, and indeed simulations from the set of model parameters given the trial types that people experience recapitulate that excessive stochasticity or noisy choices, more of that win switching behavior in silico, exactly as we observed in the online setting and in the lab. So we think we've got the right model. And this stochasticity parameter, as I mentioned, came from behavioral ecology, and I think gives us sort of an interesting twist on what we think might be going on. So these are just some pictures from predator-prey interactions, or actually prey behavior in response to a predator, ranging from, I think, water fleas all the way through to ducks. When a predator is nearby, the best thing a prey animal can do is behave as randomly as possible to avoid being counter-predicted. That's where this behavioral metric, this U value, came from. And what we find is that people who are highly paranoid sort of behave as though a predator is nearby. They behave much more randomly on the task. Perhaps we might infer to avoid being counter-predicted by us as experimenters. This isn't something that we've tested excessively, but I think it's a sort of intriguing idea. In the rat, we didn't have exactly the same changes in the contingencies that we had in the human version of the task, but nevertheless, they're choosing between 3 options, and those options are reversing every 10 trials or so. And the rats were sort of chronically treated with methamphetamine or saline for 23 days, washed out, and then tested on this probabilistic reversal learning task. And the sort of basic behavior is that under methamphetamine, the extent to which they stick after a win, which is the converse of switching after a win, is much lower. and much like in our human participants. And when we fit the model to the methamphetamine data in the rodents, as you can see across all of the sort of key parameters, the rats on meth have stronger priors about volatility and higher learning rates from uncertainty, just like the paranoid humans, both online and in person. So to convince you a bit more that there may be a sort of something there, we ran a cluster analysis where we throw together all of the parameters estimated from the 3 experiments to see, do they travel together and form any kind of coherent clusters? And the sort of short answer is that they do. So when we do this clustering with the key model parameters that are different in our tasks and in the rat experiment, what we find is sort of 2 underlying clusters of participants. Cluster 1, which seems to take in all of the methamphetamine rodents and the high paranoia humans, and cluster 2, which takes in the saline rodents and the low paranoia humans. So it seems to be that a particular pattern of parameters driven by phasic volatility learning rate and prior on volatility seem to define a group of participants that comprises rats on methamphetamine and humans who are paranoid. And just some important kind of controls. If we only use half of the data, we see the same pattern. If we fit to the other half of the data, we see the same pattern. If we only fit it on humans, we see the same pattern. And if we only fit it on rats, we see the same pattern. So there does seem to be some kind of consistency across this fitting procedure. So to summarize sort of so far, what I've told you is that people with paranoia behave as though the world is more volatile than it actually is, and they're slower to sort of learn from that volatility, ironically or appropriately, right? So they can't kind of learn to predict when things really are volatile in order to sort of marshal their responses appropriately. And this sort of fits rather nicely with an essay by Richard Hofstadter, The Paranoid Style of American Politics, wherein he talks about a paranoid spokesman who sees the fate of conspiracy in apocalyptic terms, trafficking in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders and systems of human values, always manning the barricades of civilization and constantly living at a turning point. And I think that's what's happening with our wind switch behavior, right? There's a sort of sense that even the very simple environment of the task is changing when it really ought not to be. And that's leading people to sort of behave in this erratic manner. So that there might be a methamphetamine style of politics in rodents. The next part of my talk is going to focus more on conspiracy theories. This paper was just accepted to Nature Human Behavior. We just got the proofs this morning. They look really beautiful. I'm super excited to share them with you today. And this is work that was spearheaded by Praveen. Now, initially, we wanted to sort of do something more social. There's been what I call a social turn with regards to what's going on with delusions and delusional beliefs more broadly, where people are turning towards these sort of social mechanisms and reputational belief updating mechanisms that really focus on what we think about other people. That's in neuroscience more broadly too. Questions about whether there's a social brain and whether that social brain is relevant to the symptoms of serious mental illness like paranoia. And some pushback from people like Celia Hayes and John Pierce, 2 experimental psychologists who I'm a big fan of, who sort of push back and say, well, you know, if you want to make the claim that something is really, really social and uniquely social, maybe you should try and rule out simpler explanations and more basic learning mechanisms. That's not to say that humans and other animals don't have exquisitely socially sensitive mechanisms in their minds. But nevertheless, it's interesting to see how far you can get with non-social or more domain general mechanisms. And that's what Praveen and I set out to do in January 2020. So Praveen and Erin made a version of the card deck task wherein instead of picking between decks of cards, you're now picking between collaborators who can make your points go up or down. And they contribute to a final grade that you get, so that they're lab partners that you can choose to work with. And as we all know, sometimes collaborators are great to work with for a while, but eventually you might want to switch to a new collaborator. And that's exactly what's embodied in the task. The nice thing is that we can have this sort of social frame, but we can expose people to exactly the same contingencies, reversals, and changes in unexpected uncertainty as in the card deck task. And so in January, we set out launching both of these experiments on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and just looking to compare and contrast how people respond to these two tasks. Again, it's a sort of 30,000 foot view, but what you can see is in terms of volatility beliefs, learning rates with regards to phasic volatility and various other parameters from the task, the way people respond to the two tasks is identical, and the effects of paranoia on that responding is identical. There's no difference between that we could detect either with standard statistics or Bayes factors between how people respond to the non-social and to the social task. And we just completed this experiment around about March, I think 13th was the final day that we were in lab in person. But luckily, we knew that we could run this experiment online and continue to run it throughout the pandemic. And so not that I want to sort of be happy that we were able to profit from this sort of very miserable situation, but it did provide a unique opportunity to track how people's paranoia and how their responses to the task might change as a function of the evolving pandemic. So we just kept recruitment open, and we kept running participants and analyzing data. And as Praveen will attest, desperately trying to submit the paper and get it accepted, which we finally achieved, 18 months later. But I think the work is much improved now. We did a whole bunch of control experiments, which I'm going to show you, which I think made people believe what we were saying a little bit more. So as you can see, the pandemic really elevated people's paranoia. So these are between group ratings that were sort of acquired at various phases of the pandemic. So in light pink, prior to lockdown in early January. The middle bar is during lockdown, so from sort of March through to June or July in the US. And then reopening was early July. And what you can see is people's self-rated paranoia massively increases and significantly increases as the pandemic evolves. That's not the case for anxiety and depression. I know many people are concerned that what we're showing is sort of confounded by anxiety and depression, and we can try and covary for it, but I think you can see from this figure that they don't always lawfully travel together, and that paranoia really did peak at reopening when people started to venture out into the world, much more so than depression and anxiety. And that's manifest in changes in participants' task behavior that are interestingly modulated by the effects of local policies. So some people who completed the task on Amazon Mechanical Turk came from places that had a very vigorous lockdown, where lockdown was early and strongly enforced and continually enforced, versus some places that were a little bit looser about their lockdown policies. And at reopening, there were some places that mandated that people wear masks and have continued to have that mandate. And there were some places that simply recommended that you wear masks, but those recommendations weren't necessarily enforced. And what you can see is during lockdown, a vigorous lockdown was actually associated with less paranoia, and that was cashed out in fewer win switch choices and sort of weaker priors about volatility. But at reopening, mask mandates seem to really have heightened people's paranoia, and that's manifest as much stronger win switch behavior and stronger prior beliefs that the task was going to change a great deal. So local policies changing how people will perform on the task throughout the period of the pandemic. When we look at the social task, we also had people rate their sabotage beliefs, so how much they thought that the lab partners were out to get them and acting nefariously. And you can see that overall that belief increased as paranoia increased. And again, just focusing in on the lockdown period, in more proactive places where there was a more vigorous lockdown, sabotage beliefs were lower and volatility priors were lower too. When we look sort of geographically at the distribution of those mandate policies at reopening, we see that places that had mask mandates had participants with much higher win switch rates and much stronger beliefs that the task would be volatile relative to places where the that mask policy was merely a recommendation to wear a mask. And we borrowed an analysis from econometrics called a difference in differences analysis that's increasingly being adopted in neuroscience and cognitive science more broadly to compare those policies and their impact on people's paranoid beliefs. So what I'm showing you here is that before reopening, before the lockdown was lifted and people started to venture out into the world, the trajectory of people's paranoia was sort of roughly similar in places that had mandates versus merely recommendation. However, as people were encouraged to go out into the world under a mask mandate, their paranoia really peaked, and significantly so. And the nice thing about this analysis is it does warrant a certain degree of causal inference. So perhaps this might be an explanation for why people have found it hard to adhere to various mitigating strategies and policies, because they've been sort of afraid, increasingly so as a result of sort of more stringent policies that have been imposed on them. We tested that idea with a multiple regression analysis that took into consideration the local policy about mask wearing, the local culture. So are you in a place, a state in the US where people usually follow the rules, or whether things are perhaps a little bit looser? And we borrowed data from Dynata, which were published in the New York Times, showing that people's sort of estimates of how much people are wearing masks around them during that reopening period. And what we find is a sort of interesting three-way interaction wherein paranoia, and to some extent task behavior, is highest where people usually follow the rules, where there is a rule, so where there's a mandate, but where people perceive that others around them aren't following the rules. So when social norms are valued, but those norms aren't really being followed, people become more paranoid. And it sort of indicates that people are sort of conditional cooperators, right? They'll go along with others to the extent that they see others going along with them. And that's been really challenging throughout the pandemic, I think. There were some concerns that we were merely just sampling different participant pools as the pandemic progressed, right? More people were at home, then more people were going back to work. We didn't see any changes in the demographic features across the different periods that we assessed. And we even worked with Cloud Research, which is the sort of company behind the sampling strategies that Amazon Mechanical Turk uses to access the sort of 6 million or so other experiments that were being conducted at the same time. And we show that our data don't differ from that underlying population, and they don't change, neither the population nor our data change demographically as the pandemic proceeds. So it isn't the case that we just happen to sample more paranoid people. It does seem to be a change that occurred. And we didn't just sample people from different states, right? So overall, the pattern of responding in all of the experiments matches across pandemic periods, and our experiments match the sort of demographic or geographical locations of the participants that would be typical of Amazon Mechanical Turk. So again, we don't think we just happen to sample more people from mandate states, for example. Interestingly, we started after July to realize that there was sort of interesting stuff going on with regards to people's beliefs about the pandemic, as well as just their paranoia more broadly. And what we find is that people's paranoia correlates with their beliefs in COVID vaccine conspiracies, and their COVID vaccine conspiracy beliefs also sort of lawfully correlate with their erratic task behavior and their estimated priors on volatility for the task. So if you're someone who harbors lots of conspiratorial beliefs about the pandemic, you also approach the task in a much more sort of volatile and erratic way, just like paranoid participants. And that manifests also in their endorsement of the QAnon conspiracy. So these were data that were measured sort of before the election, over the summer. If you're someone who believes in the QAnon conspiracy, you're much more likely to self-endorse lots more paranoia. And again, you approach our task in an erratic manner, both raw behavioral wise and in terms of your prior beliefs that were estimated from your behavior. So people who endorse the QAnon conspiracy tend to be more paranoid. I'm sure that's not very surprising, but they also behave towards our task in a more paranoid manner. And that breaks down across political parties, as you might expect, right? So more Republicans endorse QAnon beliefs. It is more of a right-wing belief, although some Democrats do too, and they tend to be more paranoid more broadly, and that again is capturing their wind switch and volatility beliefs as well. We also did a within subject study that isn't part of the new paper because it didn't quite work out the way we had hoped. We didn't have a really good control. We did all of our work in America. It would have been nice to have gathered some data in a country that wasn't going through an election, but we did track the same people over time, pre and post the election. And what we find is that paranoia significantly decreased after the election. Not a huge effect, but still a significant decrease. And that was strongest in Democrats and not present in Republicans. Not surprising given the outcome of the election. But interestingly, that was also manifest in terms of their wind switch rates. So people behave less erratically towards the task after the election, and their volatility prior. So some evidence that an event in the world that's changing people's beliefs is also changing their task behavior and within subjects this time. I presented these data around about October to Klaas Stefan and his computational psychiatry unit in Zurich, and he asked a really great question. And the power of this platform is that we could then go and test find the answer to that question really, really quickly, right? So what I showed you, I think, in one of our experiments was that in the social task, we asked people to rate how much they believe that the partners are sabotaging them. Klaas asked, do you ever ask people whether they think the card decks are sabotaging them? Which would be a really nice test of this sort of more domain general theory, right? That uncertain things garner, paranoid beliefs. And indeed, when we went back and asked people, a new set of people, an independent sample of people, we went back and asked them whether the card decks were conspiring against them. They actually believed that they were, and they believed that more strongly the more paranoid that they were. So again, a little bit of evidence in favor of this domain general rather than domain specific theory of paranoia. In fact, the relationship between paranoia and sabotage beliefs was stronger in the non-social task than it was in the social task. So I'm going to stop here and sort of summarize and tell you what I've told you, and then I'd be delighted to kind of open it up and have more of a discussion. But what I think I've shown you today is that paranoia relates to non-social belief updating deficits across patients, across the continuum in the general population, and maybe across species as well. Similar effects of paranoia on social and non-social belief updating, sort of consistent with the idea that there may not necessarily be anything special about social mechanisms when it comes to paranoia, even though paranoia is, of course, an exquisitely social phenomenon. I've shown you, I think, that increases in real-world uncertainty increase people's paranoia, and that's cashed out in their behavior and their model parameters too that are estimated from that behavior. And those effects are modulated by local policies, local politics, national politics, and other events in the world. And that's really, really important because it seems to impact their attitudes towards prevention strategies like mask wearing and like vaccines. So perhaps some of the hesitancy that we're seeing is a sort of residual effect of some of those things that were happening earlier on during the pandemic. And I'll just sort of stop there. Thank you for your attention. Thank Praveen, who really did most of this work, and Erin, who was really the generator of many of these original ideas with that experiment that we did long before the pandemic was even a word that we sort of understood. The rest of my lab and collaborators, Jane and Steph, who provided the rat data, Stefan, who really helped us get the task online, and Chris Mathis, who's really pioneered the hierarchical Gaussian filter model that we use. And I'll stop there and be happy to sort of join the conversation and discussion. Thank you.
All right, thanks.